sort of do recording is happening. Do whatever makes that recording process feel comfortable for you in this space. That heads up. So to kick things off, I can introduce myself. So my name is Joanna, she, her pronouns, and I am part of the backbone team of the Community Planning Table. And I'm really excited to be here on behalf of the CYPT and the Immigration Partnership. I'd like to welcome everybody to Anti-Racism 102. The 101 session, if folks have attended, which I imagine many of you have, was amazing. And I'm really, really excited that we get this opportunity to continue to learn and grow together with Evelyn and Vanessa. So this process or this experience that we're going to be joined in together today is Immigration Partnership and the Children and Youth Planning Table to build capacity for anti-racism and equity work here in Waterloo Region. So I would like to welcome Evelyn Amponsa and her colleague Vanessa Orque, and please correct me at any point if I mispronounce anything, from Amponsa and Yavoa Consulting. Evelyn and Vanessa are from Toronto and have more than 10 years of experience engaging people from grassroots to executive leadership and anti-racism training and building organizational capacity to confront racism and to be anti-racist. Folks are welcome to introduce yourselves in the chat so that Evelyn and Vanessa can get a chance to meet folks and to know who's in the space with us today. And to kick us off, I'd like to start with a territorial acknowledgement. So we would like to begin today's learning event by acknowledging that we are broadcasting today for Evelyn and Vanessa on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, Chippewa peoples. The territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. And for those of us in Waterloo Region, like myself today, we're also broadcasting from the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples on land that is within the Haldeman Tract, which encompasses 6 miles on either side of the Grand River and was promised to the Six Nations. I encourage folks who aren't joining us from the territories mentioned to include your territory, the territory in which you are residing or working on, in the chat. And I can also include a link to a resource where if you're unsure about which territory you're joining from, you can check it out in the chat there. There's a really great resource to kind of find where you're situated and to learn a little bit more about the treaty territory that you're situated in. And I also encourage folks that if you've got the time to check out that resource, there's a lot of really great pieces on that website as well. I know for myself, I've been grappling a lot with the concept of territory acknowledgements and what it means for me as a white settler in this community to be doing territory acknowledgement. They don't kind of get sort of stuck in this like performative space of this is just what we do now, but how are we actually using them as spaces for growth and learning and sort of to move to action. So there's a lot of really great reflection pieces on that website and a lot of really great in-depth sort of like reflection questions to ask yourself when you're engaging in these conversations about territorial acknowledgements or land acknowledgements, or even what the difference between the two is. And a lot of those questions I know are going to be part of our discussion today in what is just going to be a fantastic morning of learning. I'm graciously going to turn things over to Evelyn and Vanessa and excited to be part of this learning journey today.
Thank you, Joanna. Good morning, everyone. And yeah, thanks for joining us on a Friday morning. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure it's been a long week for everybody. It's been a long, I don't know, year. It's just been a long year of the time just repeating itself over and over. We're like in a time warps, I feel like. But thank you for joining. And you know, also this session is a leadership session. We've been doing sessions for frontline staff and then sessions for leadership. And so the idea is that the sessions are actually pretty similar in terms of content, but the approach is different for frontline and for leadership staff. And I share that so that if you're going to go back to your organizations and sort of continue this conversation, which I encourage folks to do, you have a foundation to have the same conversation, because this sessions are fairly similar, and just the approach is a little bit different. And so I'm just going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. The first half an hour or so is an attempt to sort of give you some tools to think about the case studies for when we go into the breakout sessions. And so and sort of following along for the first half an hour, I'm going to be describing a few different pieces as tools that we can use. And then when you go into the breakout sessions, try to think about how you could use those tools to respond to some of the case studies that we will be discussing. A little bit of a heads up, because we have about 7 or 8 case studies, but we've been not really getting through all of them. And so I think, Vanessa, maybe what we can do this time is we can go through all of them in the beginning of the breakout session rooms, and then we can maybe prioritize the ones we want to kind of go through first. We got some feedback from the last group saying that might be a useful way to go about them. So we'll do that in the beginning of the session, the breakout session. So I'll just share my screen. Where are we at? Here we go. Okay. So one of the first things I want us to think about is thinking about racism as a risk. And this has been a very useful way for me to think about and to talk about racism while I'm doing training. So, a risk is something that we can anticipate it will happen. Also something that we can put processes and procedures into place to either mitigate the impact of the risk or to make sure that it doesn't happen, right? So when there's lots of things that we consider risk, and there's a lot of ways in which we manage risk, especially as leaders, right? As leaders, we think about health and safety and we try to manage those risks. We think about slip and fall, for example, and we try to manage those risks, right? So in the winter, we know that the sidewalk can get icy, and because the sidewalk can get icy, folks might slip. Percent sure that they're going to slip and fall, but there's a high likelihood that they're going to. And so what do? We salt the sidewalk to kind of prevent or mitigate, that risk and that impact, because we know if that thing was to happen, it's going to negatively impact our, not just the person that got hurt, but also, our business in that, it might, it's a liability issue and so on and so forth, right? So I want us to think about racism in that same way, right? Racism is something that, based off of staff experience, clients experience, based off of our society, based off of the environment that we're currently in, particularly the heightened awareness of racism and anti-Black racism in the past year, we know that racism is something that actually occurs pretty often, right? Even if for you it doesn't occur because it's not necessarily your experience, it's something that we can all agree that happens pretty often. And so what does that mean? It means that we can actually treat it as a risk. We can treat it as something that we know is likely to happen, and therefore we can start being proactive around us to manage it. And so the reason why I like talking about racism as a risk that can be managed, because it allows us to be proactive, right? One of the things that happens with racism is that we try to manage it after it happens, right? So we train staff to manage it after it happens. We train staff to think about, or we have policies and procedures into place. For example, like a human rights policy, that's to manage experiencing racism, like after it happens. You can sort of file a complaint, you can go through a particular process, but that's all after. So how do we start thinking about racism as a risk that we can actually manage before, right? So we can start putting things into place before. And so I'm going to list a few reasons why it's important to think about racism as a risk. The things that we talk about is, racism presents a risk to your organization if your clients or even your partners don't see you in line with their beliefs around this issue, which is a social and political issue, right? So if for me, like when I go to a store, there's this coffee shop that I love going to, and one of the reasons that I love going there is that they have a Black Lives Matter and stick in the window, some stickers that speak about queer rights. They have issues. So everything that I believe in, they also support those social and political causes. And so I like giving them my money, right? Because I know that they're in line with some of the things that I also believe in. I also feel safe going there because I know they're going to treat me from those particular lenses, right? Like they have an understanding of those things. So a lot of people, particularly today when our society has a heightened awareness of these social and political issues, places where they go take a stand on these social and political issues. And if you don't do that, it can present a risk, right? We've seen it happen with a lot of corporations where they either didn't take a stand or they took a stand that wasn't in line with a lot of folks' beliefs, and therefore they lost business because of that, right? So even really recently, in a really kind of frivolous example, is what was this show where the host made a comment about the interview with Prince Harry, right? Was it some morning show or one of these like talk show, The Real? And because of what happened, right, people are like, well, I'm not watching this show. And then what ends up happening, the host gets fired, right? Like, it's because we understand that we want to see folks take a stand that is in line with, what our values are. So as an organization, it's important for you to sort of think about how if you don't take that stand, right, that is a risk for you in terms of how your clients feel and so on and so forth. Another reason why racism is a risk is when and employees don't feel activity and innovation suffer, right? If employees don't feel that they're in a safe workplace, then they aren't going to be creative or innovative. They're not going to have the confidence to really try to problem solve and do the things that are necessary to problem solve. What happens is that people are just like, they just come into work and they just do their job, they get their paycheck and they leave, right? And because they're like, I'm just here for a paycheck because, this place doesn't really support me. I don't really feel safe here. So you don't get the same level of investment when employees don't feel safe because they are experiencing racism. Then the creativity and innovation suffers, which then impacts your workplace as well. Discrimination in the workplace can harm employee health and an organization's productivity. It increases absenteeism and health issues among employees. And so we've seen studies that demonstrate that when employees are, even something like experiencing microaggressions at work, they are more likely to call in sick because they just don't want to deal with it, right? Like that one day you have that meeting with that thing that's just not funny, right? You're like, you know what? I actually just don't have the energy for it today. And you'll call in sick even if you're not sick, right? So if we don't manage those things in our workplaces, then employees' mental and emotional health that's being impacted by something that, is a microaggression that most folks think is pretty small, it actually impacts an employee's ability to show up to work, right? We've all had those days where we've just sat in our car for like 20 minutes before going into the office. When we used to go into the office, but because we're like you try to just build up that and for folks that are experiencing discrimination and racism and the organization is not taking it seriously, it actually increases absenteeism, right? Structural racism that results in lower wages for Black people, even more so for Black women and other racialized groups, is also a risk that that we need to think about, right? So if because of structural racism, Black people are being paid less at work, therefore are in lower income brackets, right? Then there is a higher levels of poverty, Black communities, work is not, there's more precarious labor and such, right? Which then has all of these other impacts around health issues, so for example, COVID is like a perfect example of this, right? The industries where you find Black and racialized people are also the spaces where there's higher rates of COVID, right? And also, and because these industries also are more precarious, there's also a lack of benefits, which means folks can't, and we're all trying to advocate for sick days, et cetera, et cetera. So we see how the industry that you work in, how that has, an impact in other areas of your life, including health outcomes. And then thinking about when we are people that are racialized, ethnic, Black, Indigenous, et cetera, go into the workplace and they're seeing, for example, their white colleagues being promoted or being rewarded while they are not, it creates an environment where, again, you don't feel valued. And if you don't feel valued at work, it means you're not going to do your best work. And then when you're not doing your best work, instead of the system sort of being blamed for that, you get right. So then we start seeing higher rates of lower rates of retention in these kinds of positions. And for a lot of us, as we are moving towards increasing the representation of racialized Black and Indigenous people in our workplaces, we also need to think about how are we creating safe enough workplaces where we're retaining these kinds of we're retaining people, right? Because just because you have an initiative that says you want more, racialized people and Black people or Indigenous people doesn't mean you've actually created safe and valued, meaning you're going to actually retain. And so studies actually show that Black people that are in leadership positions are more likely to leave those positions because they don't feel safe in those workplaces or valued. Because there's these initiatives to increase the presence, but there aren't initiatives to actually change the workplace culture and workplace environment. Right. And the last piece here is thinking about racialized staff being subjected to excessive surveillance and scrutiny by colleagues, supervisors, and managers. So if you remember from the first training that we did, we talked a lot about stereotypes, right? And so if we have bought into these stereotypes and they exist somewhere in our subconscious, it means that we then we surveil and we scrutinize folks who are impacted by those stereotypes more than other groups of people. So studies have shown that racialized Black people are often asked to present sick notes from their doctor more than their colleagues for being off of work. Or, there's this hilarious episode of The Office, if people watch The Office, where Dwight follows, I think, Meredith home, and he's just doing all of this kind of investigation because he doesn't believe she's not well. That's a common experience for folks who are racialized, where they have to prove they're sick or why they are not at work more than other groups, right? And if we connect that back to this piece where, I might just not be coming to work because I'm experiencing discrimination or racism. I might not be physically sick. How do I get a doctor's note to kind of explain that, right? So then there's a disconnect. So it seems like I'm lying. It seems like I just don't want to be at work, when actually I'm experiencing some of these mental health or emotional health barriers that doesn't. How do you prove that? I saw something come up in the chat. Please let me know if it's something I need to address. And okay, I see it's just a comment about, Daryl, yes, about The Office. And so it's really important for us to think about, risk and how we can manage risk, within our workplace, or how we can manage racism as a risk. Because there's so many other things that we manage as risk, but we haven't managed racism as a risk. One of the other things we have to think about is staff often feel the pressure of negotiating harm due to policies and procedures that are more focused. And what that means is the other things that we manage as risk sometimes impact how we can deliver service, right? So if I want a really good example at TCHC, which is where I'm currently working, we have a lot of staff that work on a front line directly with tenants, and they're working with vulnerable tenants. But we have a risk policy, or a policy that says you're not allowed to take tenants in your car. You can't take clients in your car. Right. And so that's about managing risk, because if there is an accident or something that happens, then we become liable. But what about that work directly with these tenants have said is that sometimes that's a barrier. If you have a vulnerable tenant that needs to go to OW office, that needs to go, do something, and you want to be able to drive them because they're experiencing some sort of crisis, right? And it's happened in a lot of places, a lot of situations. But then you're not allowed to, because of this other policy that's managing a particular kind of risk, then it actually impacts your ability to deliver that service. And so what you have to do as a frontline staff is either you just decide to break that rule, tenant anyway, therefore maybe risking being written up, or you choose to not do it, not take the tenant in your car, and then you might break that relationship and that trust you have with that tenant. So it's like you're constantly kind of negotiating harm. And so when we don't include racism as a risk that we need to manage, then you're asking staff to prioritize other risks, which then sort of make it difficult for them to do their work. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide for the sake of time. But does anybody have any questions? Because I really want us to take the racism as a risk into the case studies. Any questions, thoughts? Pretty straightforward. Okay, I see some folks nodding and stuff. Okay, awesome. Okay, good. Oh,
Evelyn, I'll just jump in quick. I'm Christine, and I'm from Rising Oaks Early Learning. And as someone who has been sort of taking the lead on discussions, this concept really resonates with me, and I appreciate it.
Thank you for sharing that. The other thing I actually wanted to mention that I forgot to mention is that once we also start having these conversations and we're encouraging staff like Christine, for example, to start talking about racism, there's also a risk presented to those staff who are taking on these initiatives, right? Because then other staff who are adverse to change or who don't want to hear it, they then can start treating somebody like Christine differently. Right? They can start treating their colleagues differently. And this often happens when you have, like for me, for example, so my work is to talk about race and racism all the time. People are just tired of hearing from me, right? So, and so in a way, that's a particular kind of risk, undermine my credibility. People do try to question what I'm saying, and so we have to also think about, when we're taking on these initiatives at work, what is the risk to the staff that are the visible staff, the face of these kinds of initiatives, right? Are their jobs at risk? Are their mental health, their emotional health, the amount of time they're spending putting into this, the fact that they often have to speak to colleagues and convince colleagues that this is an important thing for us to be working on, that presents a different kind of risk as well to folks' mental health. So I often ask organizations, what kind of mental health supports are you providing for staff who are on the front line of doing the anti-racism work, right? Because it is really difficult work when you are having to convince staff that don't want to change, that are sometimes racist subconsciously or consciously, that this is an initiative that's worthwhile. Okay, oops, okay. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I saw a couple of things come up in the chat, but if I don't think they are, okay, cool, I think we're good. So one of the other things that we have to race as well, but to risk as well, but not directly, but negotiating internal anti-racism goals of an organization with external partners. So thinking about our funders, the government, the collaboratives that we work with, our vendors, sometimes our internal anti-racism goals are not in alignment with our funders, for example, or are not in alignment with these other groups that we work with, vendors, for example. Vendors are a really good example. And so how do you racism goals of an organization with external partners? So I know I'm not sure if there's folks on this call who work with the school system, because I know there are some folks that do some youth work with the children and youth table, for example, right? So if you're doing anything that has to do with children and youth, of course, children and youth are impacted by the school system. So they might not be a direct partner, but they are a partner, a space that we have to think about and negotiate. And so sometimes the work that we're doing internally around anti-racism, because we're trying to, mitigate or balance, some of the impacts of the education system that might be having on our youth by having after school programs, homework help, et cetera, et cetera. Those programs internally, if we're unable to impact that external space, which is the school system, then those programs can become sort of like meaningless, right? Because if somebody comes to your after school program for like an hour and a half one day, but they're still going to school and experiencing racism, then that hour and a half doesn't actually, it doesn't change that experience that they're having in the school system? How do we influence those external partnerships? How do we navigate, our internal anti-racism goals with external things are happening externally? Another example I like to share with folks is thinking about Citizenship and Immigration Canada, for example, right? So if you're funded by Citizenship and Immigration Canada, I don't know if anybody here on the call is, that you can't provide services for folks who are not, who are undocumented, right? So you can only provide services for folks who are, I think, PR, right? And so how does that actually counter our anti-racism goals? Because we know that a lot of folks who are racialized sometimes are also undocumented. And so if we want to provide services for them, but the funder is saying you can't provide services for people who are undocumented with our funds, then that's a tension that we kind of have to negotiate. That is a barrier for us achieving those internal anti-racism goals. So how do we sort of navigate those pieces? Working with vendors. So again, I work at Toronto Community Housing, and we sometimes pairs in our units to provide services to tenants. And when we were doing consultations with tenants, racialized tenants, they said that sometimes the vendors would come into their units and they would step on their prayer mats, for example, right, with their shoes, right? And so those are our vendors. These are folks that we are employing, right? We've contracted them to do this kind of work, but clearly there's a disconnect between our anti-racism goals and the way these vendors are doing their work. So even when we're working with vendors, it's important for us to recognize that the vendors still have to be aligned with our anti-racism goals. It's not everything in terms of partners where we need to be aligned, but your anti-racism goals definitely need to be aligned with your vendors, with your partners, with your government, with the governments, etc. And so even with this collaborative, right, having all of you participate from different organizations, there's something that you have in common. And one of those things is the anti-racism goal. So just imagine that part of the collaborative was like, yeah, this is an important initiative for us to take up. And another part of that collaborative was like, no, this has nothing to do with our work, right? It creates a tension within the way that you're able to work together as a collaborative. But luckily, I think for the most part, everybody in this collaborative sees anti-racism as important. And so it's an initiative that you've taken up as a group, right? So how do you sort of go about this? You can create assessments to ensure that partners and collaborators' objectives are in alignment with your organization's anti-racism values. And so what, a standardized kind of chart that says, what is the work that this funder does? What is the work that this collaborative does? So there might be things that are different, but as long as the anti-racism goals are aligned, then this is a partnership that you should continue. It's important to be able to advocate against oppressive systemic policies that affect your clientele and employees. So yesterday I was having a really good conversation about the School of Social Work, right? So to be registered, to be part of that network, what is it called? To be accredited through the social work, you have to have, for example, like police reference checks and so on and so forth, right? Like that's something that's important because you're working with vulnerable people. And not to say that a police reference check by itself is an oppressive policy, but there's a way in which a police reference check can present barriers for groups that are over-policed, right? So we know that Black and racialized Indigenous groups can be over-policed. Even being carded doesn't necessarily mean you've done anything. It just means that the police have stopped you and have taken down your information. So something like a police reference check, which seems pretty neutral, can actually have this kind of impact that is racist because of the historical relationship between, for example, police and groups that are racialized. So how do we sort of like advocate against those like policies and procedures if we need to? So the group that I was working with yesterday, because they work with like vulnerable populations, it's important for them to think about, how do we think about the police reference check? Is that the only way we can ensure that our staff are, not going to cause harm to our clients? Or is there other ways that we could, police reference check can actually be against our anti-racism goals? So another good example, so TTC was trying to increase hiring of Black youth, right? And so, but they needed a police reference check to work at TTC. And so they started having to think about how that police reference check was actually a barrier to that anti-racist goal that they were trying to achieve internally. I hope that a few of these examples are helpful and make sense. Okay, I see folks nodding. Thank you. Another thing that's really important around this is being able to influence and a reputation in the sector that signifies an anti-racist organizational profile, because you want to be seen as an expert in anti-racism work so that you can actually influence that external world, right? If you're doing good work internally, then people start to see you as an expert. People start to come to your organization and say, well, look at what the YWCA is doing. They've done this great, they have this great initiative. They've been able to think about police reference checks and create other pathways to do X, Y, and Z. And people start learning from and start duplicating it externally, right? We're a sector that loves to think about best practices, right? And so how do we start positioning the work that we're doing as best practices so that we can then influence, again, the external? Because even if you're doing the work internally, if you're unable to influence the external world, then the work that you're doing internally actually becomes that much harder. Right. And not just that, it doesn't have the impact that we want it to have, because we don't just want to impact the spaces where we work. We also want to impact the external world. Right. Like because racism doesn't stop when somebody comes to your door. Right. Racism is not going to, it doesn't bring those experiences internally. So how do we start to use our organization's mandate to change and navigate the external world? How do we start to position ourselves as experts with best practices that then can help us to change the external world? So thinking about what evaluation looks like of the initiatives that you're doing, right? Are you producing research? Are you producing documents that demonstrate, you know what, like we tried this initiative. We tried to, again, I'm going to use the police reference checks because that's the example that's on my mind. We thought differently about police reference checks, and we were able to do this because we thought differently about it. And being able to share and disseminate that information within the sector is really important, right? So of course it's important for us internally to think about what anti-racism looks like, but once we start these initiatives, it's important for us to use these initiatives to then change like the external world. And then the last piece here, I think, before we get into the breakout sessions, how anti-racism changes have a positive or negative impact on belonging. And so I'm just going to read this quote. It is about understanding how to create meaningful partnerships and learning how to become an effective and conscious ally to creating lasting change. Is about evolving your mindsets to tap into what it means to be human and a member of the global community. And again, right, we're thinking about not just belonging in our workplaces, but how do we belong to the communities that we live in, and how do we live in, recognizing that our job within the social services sector is to be able to impact the global community and the communities that we live in. So of course, people come to our organizations for help and for support, but what does that have to do with the larger community? Right? Do we see our work as being able to impact the larger community, creating an inclusive environment, producing less harm in communities, and the ability to provide services to more diverse clientele? But thinking about, our grocery stores, the parks, all of the places where the folks that come to us for support, they also feel like they belong in those spaces as well. How do we connect those two, like our work with these other external experiences? And I keep going back to that piece because what I found is that a lot of organizations are doing the work internally, but it's not really impacting the society, like our larger society, in the way that we want it to, right? In our city, I'm going to use the city of Toronto, for example. In the city of Toronto, there's higher unemployment rates for folks that are Black, for example, right? Particularly young Black people. If we have an initiative internally, which is to hire, more young Black people, we just shouldn't be thinking about our internal space. We should be thinking, how do we actually impact that number that exists within our larger community, right? Because that is essentially we're doing the work to transform the space, but their whole experience, right? Having to take, coming to your organization, taking the TTC. If I come there, or taking the bus, taking public transportation, if I experience racism there, if I experience racism in the school system, when I go to the grocery store, I'm experiencing racism. Coming to your organization, right, is that's one positive experience I'm going to have, but we should aim to make sure that all of the experiences are positive, not just when folks are in our space where we can protect them, right? We want to ensure that all of the spaces can have this kind of common experience, feel like they belong in our society. Some of the negative, and it's important for us to think about some of the negatives that have when we start trying to make these changes, right? So obviously people are really uncomfortable with change. And so sometimes people are interested in anti-racism initiatives, but they are just uncomfortable with change. They've been doing their work the way that they've been doing it for so long. They feel like the change could create different kinds of risks. So again, I'm going to go back to the police reference check example. What does it mean if you tell your HR department, like, we want to sort of rethink, police reference checks? Oh my God, the HR people are going to lose, they're going to lose their minds, right? Because that the people that we're bringing in are safe, right? What if we say we want to get rid of even references because we know that if somebody doesn't have a reference, right, does that disqualify them from getting the job? How else can we think about references? But then these are all the checks and balances that we've put into place to kind of ensure we're bringing good people into our workplaces. And let's all be honest, these things don't actually guarantee that we're bringing good people into the workplace. I've had examples where, I've had heard the most glowing references from people's reference checks, and the person was horrible, right? Like that happens. Right? So we don't guarantee anything, but these are the checks and balances that we've put into place. And so now when we ask people to start rethinking these questions, they're like, we don't want to change the way that we've been doing things. This is how we've always done it, right? And so it's recognizing just because we've always done something in the way that we've done it doesn't make it right. And it's important for us to start thinking about how do we create other pathways to be able to have these conversations and do the work that we're doing. And then, last but not least, these kinds of conversations can be very triggering for folks. People can get very defensive. They want to debate, this is not the right thing to do. They deflect, right? Oh, it's not that bad. Oh, like people just have to work harder, and they come up with all of these different excuses. So how are we prepared to actually negotiate these things, particularly as leaders in an organization? How are you prepared to navigate staff being very defensive, being resistant to change, and that kind of thing? When we all had to kind of move towards this virtual reality, we all understood that it was a necessary way for us to deliver service. We understood that we had to do this, right? Right? This is important to our work, right? And so how do we get staff to start seeing anti-racism initiatives as integral to our service delivery, integral to our work, rather than seeing it as an option, right? Because that's what I face that a lot, where staff are like, well, I'm not doing this. This has nothing to do with my work, particularly folks who are in like accounting or like finance or IT. They're like, I don't see how this is relevant. Like, it's not important to us, right? But it's important for us to be able to get staff to see that that anti-racism is central to our service delivery. It's central to good customer service. It's not an option. Think about those pieces. And I think we can start, we'll unpack some of these things in the case studies as we move forward. So I'm going to stop sharing really quickly, and we are going to go into the case studies. So Catherine says she has a great example. Do you want to share it here or when we get into the case studies?
Case studies would be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what we're going to try to do, and hopefully we'll be able to do it this time. We tried it last time, it didn't really work, but we're going to try to come back we're going to try to end 5 minutes before, what time are we done? 12, sorry, 5 minutes before 12, so that we can come back as a group and kind of try to debrief and regroup and sort of conclude. We always try to do it, but we get so carried away in the case studies, and folks have other things that they got to do right after, because all our meetings are back to back to back to back these days. But let's see if we can try to end 5 minutes early and come back and do a little bit of a regroup before we go on our Fridays. So that being said, unless there's any questions, any urgent questions, then I'm going to ask that Pauline maybe break us out. No questions, no questions. Okay. The uncomfortable silences of Zoom.